It probably goes without saying, but sovereign debt isn't risk-free anymore. And I'm not just talking about Greece and Portugal. Standard & Poor's just told us today it may downgrade the United States to D, the lowest rating on its 22-rung ladder, if the debt ceiling isn't raised and the Treasury Department has to default. The challenge is figuring out just how much risk you take on buying any one country's bonds. Our next guest is more than up to that challenge. Ewen Cameron Watt is Chief Investment Strategist at the BlackRock Investment Institute. He's just developed a new way of ranking sovereign debt issuers, and he's here to tell us all about it. Ewen, though, I have to ask you first about what we heard this morning from Standard & Poor's John Chambers. He said if the United States defaults on any one of its obligations, Standard & Poor's will have no choice but to downgrade the entire sovereign credit to D. What on earth would that mean for the world's credit markets?
Well, I mean, in the event that it occurred, it would be a degree of financial Armageddon. But I think we've got to be very careful about this. John's qualifying and say if. So it is all about if the debt ceiling isn't passed.
And he believes that it will be raised.
And, you know, our ratings of the US's willingness to pay, as well as ability to pay, place it pretty highly in the global sense. So I think it's a highly unlikely event. At least I'm keeping my fingers crossed that's the outcome.
Now, financial Armageddon is a prospect none of us wants to tackle, but here's a crazy question for you. Let's say the United States is downgraded. Again, we're speaking hypothetically. Who then becomes the lowest risk issuer?
Well, in our index, as it stands at the moment, Norway is the lowest risk issuer. Places like Canada come out pretty well, so does Switzerland. Under the circumstances that I describe, I guess two things would happen. One, there'd be a rush to gold, and two, there'd be some rush to get into the, those sovereigns which weren't technically defaulting. And it's got to be clear, what Standard & Poor's are talking about is a technical default, not a practical one.
Now, let's talk a bit about your methodology, because quantifying risk is difficult.
Yeah.
People have tried to do it before. There are some simple ways of doing it, some more complicated ways of doing it. What exactly did you do? And I know that we've cooked up a bit of a graphic to help you explain this to us.
So what we did was we took 30 or 40 variables and we put them into basically 4 buckets. And we scored each country relative to each other within those buckets.
So here are some of the variables, right? Private sector risk, distance from stability, these kinds of factors went into the mix.
Indeed, some countries score very highly in some areas and lowly in others. Take Ireland. Ireland scores very low in terms of the financial sector because it's become a liability to the Irish state. It scores very highly in terms of the integrity of its institutions and its past history. Italy, as an example, doesn't score so highly in terms of its past history and the strength of the institutions, but scores reasonably highly in terms of some of the other pieces. As with any model, what you're doing is you're providing a nice, easy way to assess the risks that come out of the model. You shouldn't treat it as a black box. It's there for you to interpret and to work with.
Right, a tool, if you will.
It's a tool, absolutely. And you've got to be careful not to over-interpret it and say this country's marginally worse than it's about then taking the outputs and interpreting them.
Who's the worst on your scale?
Well, sadly, and very sadly, because it's a beautiful country, it's Greece. And I don't think that's anybody's great surprise. And you find other countries like Venezuela, down there in the low area, Egypt. Hungary scores quite lowly, which is really due to its institutions and its very shallow financial system. And it was really interesting to hear Chinese Premier Wen, on his tour of Europe this week, singling out Hungary as a country that China was prepared to continue to back in the bond markets.
Here's a question for you. How much of a role, if any, does liquidity play in these calculations? Because, again, going back to this conversation about America's credit rating, if there is a stampede into other low-risk sovereign credits, they aren't nearly as deep or as liquid as the American bond market is.
Indeed, and that's why gold comes up as something that I would expect to benefit under that circumstance. And liquidity is a good question to bring up, Erik, because it's the drying up of liquidity and the widening in spreads that's kind of one of the first market-derived signs that things are getting serious.
How closely does your methodology and the results of your study, Ewen, compare with what we see in the credit default swap market? Does the market accurately price risk when it comes to sovereign credits, or are there some distortions that can be corrected, if you will, by the study you've done at the BlackRock Investment Institute?
Well, our ratings actually correlate or match up quite closely to where 5-year CDS spreads are, much more so than agency ratings. And without wanting to be unfair, agency ratings have tended to be reactive rather than
a
proactive.
lagging indicator, right?
And, maybe that's why Standard & Poor's and these guys are being very clear about the US situation. It's their method. They did it 15 years ago, been there before. But I think we find that our ratings do tie up fairly closely with the CDS spreads.
Ewen, great to have you here on the Inside Track. Ewen Cameron Watt, Chief Investment Strategist at the BlackRock Investment Institute.